75 years. That's how long it took to build Ligonier Ministries into one of the most influential Reformed teaching organizations in America. Millions of books sold. Hundreds of thousands of students trained. A seminary. A publishing house. A media empire that reaches into homes across the country every day. It took one vote to walk away from it all. In May 2024, St. Andrew's Chapel in Sanford, Florida, the church R.C. Sproul founded, the congregation at the heart of Ligonier Ministries, voted to leave the Presbyterian Church in America. Not because of scandal, not because of financial collapse, not because the PCA had embraced heresy or abandoned the gospel. They left because of women. Specifically, because the PCA won't clearly say that women cannot teach men theology in any context, including in parachurch ministries, conferences, and seminaries. St. Andrew's and Ligonier wanted a definitive statement. The PCA refused to give one. And so one of the denomination's most prominent churches, founded by one of its most influential theologians, walked out the door. This is not what anyone predicted when R.C. Sproul helped found the PCA in 1973. This is not what the denomination expected when it became the fastest-growing Presbyterian body in America. This is not the kind of split that makes headlines: no sex scandal, no financial fraud, no theological liberalism. This is something else entirely. Something that reveals a fracture running through conservative Reformed Christianity that most churches are afraid to name. A fracture over authority, interpretation, and what happens when the pursuit of theological precision collides with institutional unity. The question is not whether St. Andrew's left. That's documented fact. The question is why and what it reveals about the future of Reformed Christianity in America. To understand what happened, you have to understand who R.C. Sproul was and what he built. Robert Charles Sproul died in 2017, but his influence remains everywhere in Reformed circles. He authored more than 100 books. His Renewing Your Mind radio program reached millions. His teaching conferences packed auditoriums with thousands of pastors and lay people hungry for theological depth. He founded Reformation Bible College. He built St. Andrew's Chapel from the ground up in 1997, designing both the worship and the governance to reflect his convictions about Reformed theology and Presbyterian polity. Picture St. Andrew's on a Sunday morning in 2010. The sanctuary seats over 1,000 people. The liturgy is traditional: scripture reading, psalm singing, exposition-heavy preaching. R.C. Sproul stands in the pulpit, teaching through Romans with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of an evangelist. The congregation includes retirees who moved to Florida to sit under his teaching, young families drawn by Ligonier's reputation, and theology students from Reformation Bible College sitting in the balcony taking notes. This was not just a church, it was a flagship, a model of what Reformed worship and teaching should look like. And it was deeply, intentionally Presbyterian, governed by elders, connected to other churches through presbytery, committed to the PCA's confessional standards. After Sproul's death, leadership passed to his son-in-law, Burke Parsons, who serves as senior pastor and also as chief publishing officer for Ligonier Ministries. The church continued to grow. Ligonier's influence continued to expand. Everything seemed stable. Then came the debates. Starting in 2017, discussions began within the PCA about women's roles in ministry. Not about ordaining women as pastors or elders, the PCA has always prohibited that, but about whether women could teach theology to mixed audiences at conferences. Whether they could serve as seminary professors teaching male students, whether parachurch ministries affiliated with PCA churches could feature women as theological instructors. The 2019 General Assembly debated whether to censure teaching venues where women taught men. It failed. The 2022 Assembly considered overtures about women teaching in seminary contexts. Those failed too. In 2023, another round of overtures sought to clarify that women could not exercise teaching authority over men in any ecclesial or para-ecclesial context. The Assembly voted them down. Each time, St. Andrews and Ligonier watched, and each time they became more convinced that the PCA would not take a definitive stand. James Patterson, an elder at St. Andrews for 12 years, described the growing frustration. I remember sitting in session meetings after each General Assembly, reading the reports, feeling like we were being asked to accept something we fundamentally couldn't accept. We weren't asking for innovation. We were asking the denomination to clearly affirm what we believed Scripture taught. And every year, the answer was no. Or worse, we need more study. How much more study does it take? The final breaking point came in 2024. The General Assembly again declined to adopt strict prohibitions on women teaching men in parachurch contexts. For St. Andrew's leadership, this was enough. They believed the PCA's ambiguity was not neutral. It was capitulation. In May 2024, St. Andrew's session brought a proposal to the congregation: leave the PCA and join the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, a smaller, more conservative Presbyterian denomination. The proposal passed overwhelmingly. 87% voted to leave. Burke Parsons released a statement explaining the decision. We believe that Scripture clearly teaches complementarian principles that extend beyond the local church into all contexts where theological instruction occurs. We can no longer remain in a denomination that refuses to affirm this clearly. But not everyone at St. Andrews agreed. Rebecca Chen, who had attended St. Andrews for 8 years with her family, voted against leaving. I'm complementarian, she explained. I believe in male headship in the church and home. But I don't think this issue was worth splitting over. The PCA isn't ordaining women. They're just allowing some flexibility in parachurch contexts. That felt like wisdom to me, not compromise. When the vote passed, we had a choice: stay at a church that left our denomination or find a new church. We found a new church. Approximately 30 families left St. Andrews in the months following the vote. Some joined other PCA churches in the area. Others, like the Chens, felt betrayed by what they saw as unnecessary division over secondary issues. Dr. Amy Reynolds, a New Testament scholar who had spoken at Ligonier conferences twice in the early 2010s, remembers being quietly told in 2018 that she wouldn't be invited back. The explanation was vague, she recalled. Something about reconsidering our position on teaching formats. I knew what it meant. I wasn't teaching on Sunday mornings. I wasn't claiming pastoral authority. I was giving academic lectures on Greek grammar and textual criticism at conferences. But that was now too much. It stung, not because I felt entitled to speak, but because it felt like my scholarship was suddenly suspect, simply because I'm a woman. The departure was orderly. No lawsuits over property. St. Andrews owned its buildings outright. No shouting matches at presbytery meetings. Just a clean, procedurally correct exit. But the significance was enormous. This was R.C. Sproul's church, the congregation founded by one of the PCA's most influential voices, declaring that the denomination had failed. St. Andrews is not alone, and that's what makes this significant. Since 2020, the PCA has lost approximately 47 congregations, less than 3% of the denomination's 1,900 churches. But the pattern matters more than the raw numbers. Most of these churches cite theological concerns, women's roles, debates over racial reconciliation, or disagreements over sexuality and marriage. And the churches leaving are disproportionately large, influential, and financially significant. Mark Thompson, a PCA pastor in Atlanta who served his congregation for 18 years, watched St. Andrew's departure with a mixture of grief and understanding. I love the PCA, he said in a phone interview, but I also can't fault St. Andrews. Every year we send overtures asking for clarity. Every year they die in committee or get voted down. At some point you have to ask, are we even fighting for the same things anymore? I'm not ready to leave, but I understand why they did. The profile of frustrated churches is remarkably consistent. These are not culturally fundamentalist congregations. They're not King James-only churches worried about contemporary music. These are sophisticated, theologically rigorous, confessionally reformed churches. They read the Puritans, they study the Westminster Standards, they're committed to expositional preaching and robust theological education. What unites them is a conviction that complementarianism is not a secondary issue. It's not about culture war politics, it's about biblical authority and how the church structures itself according to Scripture. If stories like this matter to you, if you want to understand the deeper forces reshaping American Christianity, subscribe to Christian Faith Archive. We investigate the institutional collapses, theological conflicts, and transformations that are rewriting the future of faith in America. But not everyone in the PCA sees this as institutional failure. Dr. Sean Michael Lucas, senior pastor of Independent Presbyterian Church in Memphis and a PCA historian, argues that the denomination's refusal to micromanage parachurch ministries is a feature, not a bug. We're a connectional church, he explained in a 2024 sermon addressing the controversy, but we're not a top-down hierarchy. Local churches and parachurch ministries have freedom to discern these questions within biblical bounds. That's Presbyterian polity. It trusts local wisdom. This view is common among what might be called the PCA's theological moderates, pastors and elders who are complementarian but believe the denomination should allow diversity of application in non-church contexts. They see St. Andrew's departure not as courageous conviction, but as unnecessary rigidity. One pastor in North Carolina who requested anonymity to avoid further conflict put it bluntly, St. Andrew's wants the PCA to be something it's not. A top-down confessional denomination that enforces uniformity on every question. That's not how we operate. We're Presbyterian, not papal. Sometimes that means living with disagreement on secondary applications of primary principles. This tension between those who see complementarianism as requiring total clarity and those who see room for prudential judgment has been building for years, but it's accelerating. 3 other PCA churches, 2 in Georgia, 1 in Tennessee, are in active discussions about following St. Andrews to the ARP. At least a dozen more have formed study committees to evaluate denominational options. And in private conversations at conferences and ministerial gatherings, PCA pastors across the South are asking the same question. How long can we stay? What's driving this? 4 themes emerge consistently among those frustrated with the PCA. First, theological precision. These churches believe that ambiguity on gender roles leads inevitably to capitulation. They point to mainline denominations that started by ordaining women and ended by rejecting biblical authority entirely. They see the PCA's refusal to draw clear lines as the first step down that path. Second, institutional distrust. Many believe the PCA's leadership is more interested in maintaining institutional unity than defending theological conviction. They see the repeated failures to pass complementarian overtures as evidence that denominational politics matter more than biblical fidelity. Third, parachurch influence. The rise of conferences, ministries, and organizations that operate adjacent to churches but outside denominational control has created a gray area. Should these contexts follow the same rules as churches? Strict complementarians say yes. The PCA has consistently said no, or at least not definitively. Fourth, generational anxiety. Many of these pastors and elders are in their 50s and 60s. They lived through the mainline collapse. They watched denominations embrace liberalism in the name of relevance. And they're terrified of watching it happen again in the PCA, not through overt heresy, but through slow compromise on issues they believe are foundational. To understand why this matters so much to churches like St. Andrew's, you have to understand Reformed theology's particular obsession with clarity. The Reformed tradition doesn't just value doctrine, it values precise, confessionally defined, institutionally enforced doctrine. This isn't legalism. It's conviction that truth matters, that definitions matter, that saying exactly what you believe and holding each other accountable to it matters. The Westminster Confession of Faith, which the PCA subscribes to, runs over 30,000 words. It addresses everything from providence to the civil magistrate to lawful oaths. Reformed Christianity doesn't do ambiguity well. It wants definitions, boundaries, standards. So when the PCA declines to definitively state what complementarianism requires, leaving room for multiple interpretations, allowing diversity of practice, churches like St. Andrew's experience this not as generosity, but as failure. Failure to be clear, failure to lead, failure to protect the flock. James Patterson, the St. Andrew's elder, explained, "We're not asking for innovation. We're asking for clarity about what we believe Scripture already teaches. The Bible gives us principles about male headship. We're just asking the denomination to apply those principles consistently. When they won't, we have to ask, do we share the same convictions anymore?" But there's another layer here. This isn't just about women's roles, it's about authority itself. Who gets to decide what the church teaches and how? In Presbyterianism, the answer is supposed to be the church courts, sessions, presbyteries, and general assemblies making decisions collectively. But what happens when those courts won't decide? Or when they decide in ways a local church finds unconscionable? For St. Andrew's and Ligonier, the answer became clear. You leave. You find a denomination that shares your convictions and will codify them clearly. The Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, which St. Andrew's joined, is smaller than the PCA, about 250 churches compared to the PCA's 1,900. But it's also more conservative, more willing to take definitive stances, less concerned with maintaining a big tent. The ARP explicitly prohibits women from teaching men in any ecclesiastical or para-ecclesiastical context, including conferences, seminaries, and parachurch ministries. For churches frustrated by the PCA's ambiguity, that clarity is worth more than size or influence. The departure of St. Andrew's has implications far beyond one church changing denominations. First, it reveals a crisis of authority within conservative Protestantism. When a church can simply leave because it disagrees with denominational decisions, when there's no compelling reason beyond conviction to stay, denominational loyalty becomes optional. This isn't necessarily bad, but it does mean that denominations function more like voluntary associations than ecclesiastical authorities. Second, it exposes the limits of confessional subscription. The PCA requires ministers and elders to subscribe to the Westminster Confession and Catechisms. But what does subscription mean if the denomination allows wide latitude in interpretation? St. Andrew's and others argue that the PCA's position on women teaching men contradicts Westminster's teaching on church order. The PCA disagrees. Who's right? And if good faith disagreement on the meaning of the confession is possible, what does subscription actually accomplish? Third, it signals that the PCA's big tent strategy may be collapsing. For decades, the denomination tried to hold together both strict complementarians and those with more flexible views. It worked while the culture war pressures were external, but now the pressures are internal, and the tent may not be big enough. The financial impact is significant. St. Andrew's alone represented an estimated $2 to $3 million in annual giving and tithes that no longer flows through PCA channels. Ligonier Ministries, while technically independent, has functioned as a de facto PCA institution. Its conferences featured PCA pastors, its teaching resources were used in PCA churches, its reputation bolstered the denomination's credibility. That relationship is now severed. The PCA's leadership has tried to maintain unity by avoiding definitive statements. But this strategy is failing. Strict complementarians feel betrayed by the lack of clarity. And ironically, the PCA's refusal to take a hard line hasn't prevented criticism from the other direction either. Progressive evangelicals still view the PCA as too conservative, too restrictive, too committed to patriarchy. The denomination is losing churches on the right without gaining credibility on the left. This is not a sustainable position. Fourth, this raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between churches and parachurch ministries. Ligonier Ministries is not a church. It's a nonprofit organization that teaches theology. Does it need to follow the same rules as a church? Should the PCA have authority over what Ligonier teaches and who teaches it? St. Andrew's and Ligonier clearly believe the answer is yes, that theological teaching in any context should follow biblical patterns of authority. But many in the PCA disagree, seeing parachurch organizations as free to operate with more flexibility. This tension isn't going away. As Christian ministry increasingly happens outside traditional church structures, through podcasts, conferences, online courses, questions about authority and accountability will only intensify. St. Andrew's departure is not the end, it's the beginning. The 2025 General Assembly will be a reckoning. Multiple overtures on women's roles are already submitted, some seeking to restrict parachurch teaching contexts, others asking for study committees, still others proposing formal position papers. The debate will be intense, divisive, and unavoidable. If the overtures fail again, the exodus will accelerate. Pastors who have been patient, who have stayed, hoping for change, will conclude that change is impossible. More churches will leave for the ARP, for the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, or for independent status. The PCA will become smaller, but not more unified, because the frustration will remain even among churches that choose to stay. If the overtures pass, a different problem emerges. Progressive PCA churches, those that have welcomed women teaching in conferences, those that see complementarianism as applying only to ordained office, may leave instead. The denomination could fracture from the other direction. Neither option prevents division. Both guarantee it. The tragedy is that both sides believe they're defending biblical faithfulness. Strict complementarians believe they're protecting scriptural authority and God-ordained gender roles. Moderates believe they're protecting Presbyterian polity and allowing wisdom-driven application of biblical principles. Both can cite scripture, tradition, and theological authorities supporting their position. This is not a conflict between faithful and unfaithful Christians. It's a conflict between Christians with different convictions about how to apply shared commitments. But in a tradition that demands precision, that distrusts ambiguity, that believes clarity is a theological virtue, these kinds of disagreements become unbearable. Reformed Christianity keeps fracturing not because it lacks conviction, but because conviction itself becomes the wedge that splits communities apart. The St. Andrew's departure forces Reformed Christianity to confront a question it has avoided. Is theological precision compatible with institutional unity? The Reformed tradition has always believed that truth is knowable, articulable, and worth defending. But it has also fractured repeatedly throughout history. Presbyterians split from Congregationalists, then split among themselves, then split again. The PCA itself was formed in 1973 when conservatives left the mainline Presbyterian Church, USA, over liberalism. Splitting is in Reformed DNA. not because Reformed Christians are contentious, but because they believe some things are worth dividing over. St. Andrews believes women's roles in teaching is one of those things. The PCA, institutionally, does not. And so St. Andrews left. This pattern will repeat. Other churches will follow. The PCA will grow smaller and theologically narrower, or it will liberalize to keep the churches that remain. Neither option is obviously better. But here's the deeper question. What happens when conviction requires separation? R.C. Sproul spent his life teaching that doctrine matters, that theology has consequences, that Christians must be willing to stand for truth even when it costs something. St. Andrews took that teaching seriously. They looked at the PCA, concluded it would not stand where they believed Scripture stood, and left. They did exactly what Sproul taught them to do. They applied Reformed principles consistently. They chose conviction over institution, which raises one uncomfortable question that Reformed Christianity must answer. If the pursuit of theological clarity always leads to division, can Reformed churches ever build anything that lasts? Picture St. Andrew's Chapel today. The building is the same, the congregation is the same, the preaching is the same, only the denominational affiliation changed. On Sunday morning, nothing looks different. But something fundamental shifted. The church founded by one of the PCA's giants no longer believes the PCA can be trusted. The ministry that shaped millions of Reformed believers no longer wants its endorsement. The question is not whether St. Andrews was right to leave. The question is what their leaving reveals about the fractures in Reformed Christianity, fractures that run deeper than theology, deeper than polity, all the way down to the question of whether Christians who agree on the gospel can stay together when they disagree about what that gospel requires. If this investigation matters to you, if you want to understand the forces reshaping American Christianity from the inside out, subscribe to Christian Faith Archive. We don't just report on church splits. We investigate why they're happening, where they're leading, and what they reveal about the future of faith in America. New documentaries every week on the institutional collapses, theological battles, and transformations that most churches don't want you to see. Because the St. Andrews departure is not just about women's roles. It's not even just about the PCA. It's about what happens when the pursuit of truth becomes incompatible with the pursuit of unity. And that question will define Reformed Christianity for the next generation. The PCA will survive St. Andrew's leaving. But every departure like this narrows the denomination, sharpens the boundaries, and raises the cost of staying. Eventually, the only churches left will be those for whom denominational unity matters more than theological precision. And in a tradition that has always valued precision above almost everything else, that may be the greatest irony of all.